Good evening, and welcome to Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory, a conversation about one of the pressing issues in our political life these days. My name is Rabbi Moti Reber. I am the Executive Director of Kansas Interfaith Action, and we have a panel tonight to talk about different aspects of this important issue. We're here live at St. Mark United Methodist Church in Wichita, and we thank Pastor Johnson, who's on the panel, and Pastor Oliver, who's been helping us out tonight, and the rest of the staff here to help us put this program on. And we're also streaming live to the Kansas Interfaith Action Facebook page and to the St. Mark United Methodist Church YouTube channel. So we welcome everyone who's with us from those places also. We're going to, first I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Kansas Interfaith Action is, and then I'm going to start talking about our topic tonight. So Kansas Interfaith Action is a statewide, faith-based issue advocacy organization that works on a variety of racial, economic, and climate justice issues. So we focus on state advocacy, state-level advocacy, which means Topeka. So during the legislative session, anything that comes up that has to do with racial, economic, or climate justice, we will work on. And then the rest of the year, we talk to people throughout the state to build awareness of our organization and to build engagement with the issues that we work on. And that's a big part of what we're doing here tonight. So if you're interested after tonight and you'd like to get to know a little bit more about KIFA, K-I-F-A, Kansas Interfaith Action, then please look for us on the internet at kansasinterfaithaction.org or else on Facebook, Kansas Interfaith Action. So we welcome everybody who has not engaged with us before to get involved, particularly on the issue that we're talking about tonight. So there's a familiar pattern in American life. Some particularly flagrant incident of racial injustice takes place, and it forces the issue back into the attention span of mainstream America, mainstream white America, who are forced to notice, once again, how much everyday racism is still an everyday part of life in this country. So there's a moral awakening, a brief moment of awareness, and then there's a backlash, a shutting down, a retrenchment, a shutting down of whatever progress might be made during that brief period of awareness. And mostly what we hope is that enough momentum or enough progress has been built during the time of awareness that the advances outlast the retreat. In May of 2020, that moment of awareness was brought on by the death by police of George Floyd. It was followed by a summer of protests of racialized policing, and a number of important conversations took place, including in churches and including here in Kansas. We in KIFA knew that the time to talk to our constituency of mostly mainline churches about the sin of race, of systemic racism, was then during the awareness before the backlash came and the moment was lost. And the backlash has come in the guise of critical race theory, which is currently a point of furor on the political right. So there's a distinction that I want to make here between critical race theory and critical race theory. So there's two different things going on here. So the first one is critical race theory without the wiggly fingers. And that emerged from in the legal academy and spread to other fields of scholarship. It's a way of interrogating the role of race and racism in society. It critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tiers. CRT recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past, and it is not incidental to how American society developed. Instead, the sort of dark side, underside of our American greatness. Instead, it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color permeates and continues to permeate the social fabric of the nation. So here's a couple of examples. I saw a presentation about health disparities in Kansas City, Kansas. And if you overlay the redlined areas of KCK, that is the areas where Black people predominantly live, over a map of health outcome disparities, it's a perfect match. It's basically a perfect match. The exclusion of Black Americans from the FHA loan program guaranteed that they wouldn't be able to build wealth through home ownership as so many white people were able to. But here's a more kind of ripped from the headlines example. This was from earlier in August. 2 women in Ohio, 1 Black, 1 white, are convicted of embezzlement. The white woman committed more crimes over a longer period of time, stole 6 times more money, had 21 more charges, and was facing 60 years in prison, while the Black woman pled guilty to 1 charge and was facing a maximum sentence of 3 years. Yet the white woman received probation, and the Black woman received more prison time than the prosecutors were even asking for. CRT helps us to explain that this did not come from heaven, and it's not due to the foibles or the prejudices of the people involved. It's due to a long history of institutionalized racism that permeates our criminal justice system. CRT is used to explain how policies that don't mention race, or that even pride themselves on their colorblindness, are yet used to reinforce systems of racism. So that's CRT. It's a lively topic of scholarly discourse, and disagreeing with it doesn't make you a racist, but that does not warrant 500 segments on Fox News or proposed legislation in 30 states. For that, you need CRT. And this is simply a culture war weapon on the political right, a cudgel, taking its place as the latest of long line of flashpoint issues, following in the great tradition of creeping Sharia and Agenda 21 and the migrant caravan before the 2018 election. Scare tactics, political weapons, one and all. The controversy about CRT has been designed and is being used for specific political purpose. Like the Tea Party of 10 years ago, it is an astroturfed effort designed by rightist think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, supported financially by rightist billionaires like Charles Koch, and promoted by rightist media like Fox News. If you want citations for any of this, I have them, so please ask me after the panel because I can prove everything I'm saying. It's meant to rile up the base, but it is also intended as a countermove to the brief moment of racial awareness that took over the nation after the death of George Floyd. There are 3 common misperceptions about CRT. One is that it's being taught in K12, which it's not. CRT is taught at the graduate level. Second, that it's about making white people feel guilty. It's not. It's about observing systems, not individuals. And third, that it's about defining people by their race. CRT holds race to be a fluid and socially constructed category, so some sense of inherent evil, of original sin, is not part of it. What is taught in K12 is history, and here we get to the crux of the issue. The panic about CRT is meant to call into question any attempt by schools to deal with the legacy of racism in America at all, whether that be in the curriculum or even in diversity and inclusion trainings, which seem to be outlawed by the recently passed Texas law. Since the term CRT, as used in legislation, is so vague, it opens school districts up to politically motivated actors and cannot but have a chilling effect on freedom of speech and free inquiry. as schools try to avoid anything that may be interpreted, by their state legislatures included, as CRT. And of course, it won't end with K12. Recently, a Kansas state senator asked the Board of Regents to investigate whether CRT was being taught at Regents universities. In June of this year, the Kansas Senate president, held up the approval of Governor Kelly's appointment of 3 new regents in order to question them about critical race theory. Is this really the most important issue facing higher education in Kansas? Anti-CRT laws mean that the history of Black people and Native Americans, their contributions to this country, don't matter. That American history is white history, and everything else is not only extraneous, but even dangerous. If the truth about America's racial history cannot be taught, then what we are teaching is a lie. If the truth about America's racial history cannot be taught, can I get an amen on that? Then what we are teaching is a lie. The closest that this country has ever come to its articulated values of democracy, individual rights, and human dignity has been when people, Black people primarily, have forced it to. And that is the history that has to be taught. This will help us promote a more honest accounting of our past and chart a more equitable path to a harmonious and inclusive future. There's still much more work there that needs to be done. Now we have a group of panelists to explore aspects of this important issue. So I'm going to briefly introduce them now, and then we'll just go down the table and they'll share with you. Staceynell is the newly appointed Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. She comes to the governor's office from a bid for the Kansas State Senate in District 9. In addition to her work with the commission, she also led the 3rd Congressional District chapter of Kansas Interfaith Action. Hey, what a coincidence. She has a history of sign language as a sign language interpreter, as a math teacher, and she lives in Olathe with her husband and kids and their dog, Twix. All right. Dr. K. Monk Moore. Morgan, excuse me. K. Monk Morgan. Come on. It is a tongue twister. Where's my thing? Oops. There we are. Excuse me. Sorry. My technology is not helping me today. A second. There we go. Dr. K. Monk Morgan has been a college administrator for nearly 30 years and has served in roles ranging from Residence Hall Director to Assistant Dean of Fairmont College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. She currently serves Wichita State University as Vice President for Strategic Engagement and Planning. Her portfolio of responsibilities includes community and economic development, strategic planning, assessment and accreditation, and coordination of WSU's first-generation student services. Her dual passions for university life and student advocacy were created during her undergraduate years, where she served as Residence Hall Supervisor for the very trio Upward Bound math science program that she ultimately administered for 20 years. She's a teacher, student, mentor, mentee, daughter, sister, auntie, wife, and mother, a lifelong learner, an aspiring yogi, a wannabe long-distance runner, and a tried-and-true girlfriend. She lives in Wichita with her husband of 25 years, Derek, and young adult sons, Peyton and Cameron, when they are on break from college. And Reverend Robert Johnson is lead servant of St. Mark United Methodist Church. He's a member of the Board of Directors of Kansas Interfaith Action. He's a board member of Humankind Ministries and an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. At the end of the presentations, I'll say a few words about building a campaign to resist legislation forbidding critical race theory in next year's Kansas legislative session, and we'll also take questions both from inside the room and from online. So I turn it over to Stacy.
Thank you, Modi. Thank you for that introduction. I think the one thing I took away from that introduction is that you need to become involved with KIFA, I think is what I learned. So my name is Staceynell, and I am the Executive Director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. I just took that job recently, and Modi and I know each other from my involvement in KIFA, and I agreed to be a part of this panel because I think one of the things he mentioned was history. My first degree is actually in art history. I love history. And so when I start to think about the history of Kansas, it is more complicated than I think what we are led to believe. The popular narrative for the history of Kansas is that Kansas entered the Union in 1861 as a free state, right? John Brown gets his murals, the Jayhawks beat MU in football, and everyone's happy. That might be the most controversial thing I say, but in basketball, you're right. Okay, so that's the popular single sentence line about Kansas history. What I found in researching is that history is always much more complicated than any single sentence will sort of give. So if you think about the history of Kansas, it started with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Were under the idea of popular sovereignty, which is kind of a forerunner of states' rights, okay? So it wasn't so much an issue in Nebraska, because Nebraska was settled primarily by Northerners, but Kansas had this issue of being settled by people who were also slaveholders. So then there was the border wars, and there was the thing that happened. The thing that I found most interesting is that it was a much more complicated narrative than Kansas entered the Union as a free state. Before it became a state, and I brought my notes so I had my dates correctly. In 1855, there was the Topeka Constitution that they were trying to get ratified to have Kansas enter the state. But it wasn't a free state, it was for free soil, okay? Which meant that people who settled in Kansas wanted Kansas to be a free state, but because they didn't want slavery, but they didn't even want free Black people. They didn't want slaves. They didn't want Black people at all. They wanted it to be a white state. The Topeka Constitution was not ratified. In 1857, there was the Lawrence Constitution, which is probably the pendulum swang, where it's like, okay, Kansas would be a free state, and even had voting rights extended to African Americans. That one wasn't ratified. 1859, the one that wound up being ratified was the Wyandotte Constitution, that didn't go so far as to give Black people the right to vote, but had Kansas enter the Union as a free state. So I did not learn about any of these things in history. I had to, on my own, because I knew I was coming to this panel, go and dig and read about the history of Kansas. The popular narrative of Kansas entered the Union as a free state is much more complicated than what actually is the reality of it. And I think when I know that history, so Kansas entered the Union in 1861, then the Civil War breaks out in 1864. Ended in 1864, excuse me. And so with the number of African Americans who joined the Army, and then of course after emancipated who started to settle in Kansas, even that becomes more complicated, because remember, Kansas had a very complicated relationship with African Americans. Now, there are positive stories. I mean, Nicodemus is a town that was settled predominantly by freed African Americans who came from Tennessee. But then there are other places where African Americans settled where things did not go well. In 1869, in Hays, Kansas alone, there were 11 lynchings. There are hundreds of sites of lynchings. There's many tales of racial violence and intimidation. Some of these sites are even commemorated with names. For example, currently in Johnson County, there is a discussion about changing the name of a place called Negro Creek. And while the history is not conclusive about Negro Creek, there are some stories, I think people would like to believe that, oh, it was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and that's why it's called Negro Creek. Or perhaps, well, there was a large Spanish settlement near there, so maybe it was not called Negro Creek because it's just, the water is black, and so, but when historians start to dig into it, no, it was actually a site of racial violence where an escaped enslaved person had, instead of being recaptured, had chosen to end his own life there. There are many sites like that around Kansas that are either called Negro Creek or, because it was officially changed, it had been something else. It officially changed back in, I think, 1960s is when the bill finally passed. Or places called Noose Road, again, Hays, Kansas. Not to slam on Hays, but I was reading an article about Hays, where we can tell that even in the history, it's more complicated than what a headline kind of thing would tell you. So when I think about what is actually taught in terms of history, telling the history of a place, telling the history of a people, to my mind, does not diminish anything that has been accomplished since the 1860s. I don't think it says that the story is done. I think there's always things that we can grow and learn. But when I read that history of Kansas, that makes me go, I wonder, that explains why Kansas looks the way it does, right? I wanted to back up for a second to talk about the fact that even in Kansas, there's a history of sundown towns. So these are places where it sort of became known that African Americans were not welcome in these towns after dark. I was even reading a newspaper article from a liberal newspaper back in the 1860s where they wrote a newspaper article about the last Black family finally moving out and how they were happy that they finally had run off all the Black people. So it's more complicated. Now, it was shocking to me. It was shocking to me to read this history about Kansas because I like the narrative. It makes me feel good, the narrative, oh, Kansas entered the Union as a free state. I love it. Everything from beer to churches in Kansas are named Free State this, right? Free State this, Free State that. I like, okay. Let me stay on topic. I like the narrative. However, I think it doesn't, to my mind, it doesn't diminish who we are as Kansas. It doesn't diminish who we are to know the history. I think we can use it to learn about what has happened in our past, and then we can take that into our future to see, okay, how can we do better as a people? How can we do better as a society? Yes, I think that sums up really what I wanted to say. That, you know, as African Americans, I think knowing this history of Kansas may explain why there's fewer Black people in Kansas than in other places. But to me, it didn't diminish anything that Kansas has become. So to not be afraid of learning our history.
Good evening. As introduced, I'm Kay Monk Morgan. I have an opportunity. I'm a born and raised Wichitan, educated here in the great state of Kansas, here in Wichita, Kansas, multiple times over. And so I'm excited to be with you all here tonight, literally just to talk about what education is supposed to be and what it's supposed to do in a democracy. Underline, underscore, in a democracy. And this notion of critical race theory and or the abatement, anti-racism, racism, any of those types of concepts, particularly related to critical race theory. It's already been explained by our panelists that this is a theory. And as a person who represents and lives within the institution of higher education, understanding that that institution in and of itself was created for the purpose of creating, exploring, inquiry, developing, unthreading, pulling threads around theory. And so for me, I typically like to start with purpose, and I look up lots of words. What do they mean? And so when you think about what indeed is the purpose of, I'm gonna start with the university because the conversation about K12 for me is pretty null and void. There isn't a school in the country who's teaching K12 through K12 that's teaching critical race theory. As a person who recently completed a doctorate degree, I was exposed to critical race theory as I looked for theoretical framework for my dissertation. If there are 12th graders or 7th graders or 8th graders even who can understand a theoretical framework such as critical race theory, please introduce them to me. We want to enroll them right away. It's not conceptual language that's accessible to high school students. It's a doctoral theory, much like the theory of learning or social cycle development or any number of other things. You know, we can figure out Maslow's hierarchy of needs in middle school based on, you know, the little pyramids and graphic organizers, but critical race theory doesn't work that way. And so when we hear folks talk about critical race theory in K12, what that really equates to is we don't want to have culturally relevant education. And who amongst us does not want our children to be in an educational setting where the content that they're receiving is reflective of a lived experience where they can learn? Get out of the mindset of teaching, but creating an environment where our children can learn. Any data point you look at with regard to education, be it third grade literacy rates, middle school truancy, high school graduation, college going rates, students that identify as people of color tend to have rates that are less than majority students. Why would we as an entity, as a community, interested in creating an economically prosperous society, be interested in doing things that will keep us from creating an educated, well-engaged workforce and citizenry? So those things that we must do K-12 in order to encourage students to go to school, to feel comfortable in their school settings, to be able to take the knowledge that the teacher provides to them and attach it to something that they already know, which is the learning process, are critical. So when we talk about from the K-12 space, there really isn't any K-12 critical race theory piece happening. And so they've already stated, these are conversations. I graduated from high school here in Wichita, and I can remember, ask any African-American student that's moving up through K-12, when do you talk about Black history? And they will tell you February. And then you ask them what you learn. Jimmy Kimmel does this 100, ask the man walking down the street. They will tell you Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, ... And if you ask them to get to 5, you're gonna have a problem because they're not gonna be able to name anybody else unless maybe George Washington Carver, maybe Rosa Parks. Okay, so we got 5. But if you think about how our children what concepts are being created or taught in school, there is no critical race theory. In fact, and some might argue, there's not enough criticality or critique of anything. So this notion of teaching history in a way that it is relevant and it is inclusive of all people's experience is what it is that we'd like to be able to do. Our job as educators is to create students who can solve problems. You can only solve a problem if you can diagnose it. You cannot diagnose a problem that you don't have all the information for. So if I'm a young person who grows up in the inner city of any numbers of communities, take Kansas City, for example, you mentioned the redlining. We had that issue here in Wichita as well. And I grow up in a community that looks dilapidated and under-resourced, and I look at other communities that don't look that way. I think it's my fault. I did that, I created it, or my parents did something, or by God, my grandparents did something, without understanding that this isn't that the system is broken, it's that the system worked. You were placed in that particular geographic area by design. That's education, that's power. That's powerful for the students of color. It's equally powerful for the students who are not of color in order to understand the system, the organization, the community, and how to solve the problems that my mom's generation, my grandpa's generation, and heaven help, my generation have not yet been able to conquer. So this notion of critical race theory showing up in K-12 just really isn't a thing. What it does tend to do is scare the bejeebies out of teachers who are trying to do a fantastic job of providing educational opportunity for students who need to be inspired to believe that education is their right and their responsibility. It's terrifying for a social work teacher to get to that chapter about Civil War. And what do I tell them? What are the resources that are available to them to explain why our country decided to almost fracture itself? What were the issues at the time? It's one thing to understand the dates. It's another thing to understand the impact, what happened and why it happened. So there's a chilling effect that happens for teachers, and you're seeing it for those of you that read educational emails. I get these blasts that come out every day from professional organizations you sign up for. Teachers quitting every day for fear of walking into spaces, particularly faculty and staff, teachers of color. In some cases, in communities where they may be one of very few who are now being challenged by their community about even the way they show up. Whether you have natural hair or not makes you look a little bit more radical, right? So this K12 thing, really, believe it or not, really isn't a thing. We don't have to fear critical race theory showing up at your local middle school. They are much more concerned about a lot of other things that happen in middle school than critical race theory. At the higher ed level, again, institutions, universities were created to be dynamic petri dishes, if you will, of idea. No good idea, bad idea, just ideas that we unpack to see which of those have grow legs, right? And so this notion of research and scientific inquiry and these theories that are, I tell my kids, it's like putting on a pair of glasses and looking at a natural phenomena to see whether or not it changes what you see or it explains something that you've seen. And if it doesn't, you put it down and you pick up another theory. And you look at that lens to see if it explains the phenomena that you're seeing. And if it doesn't, you put that down and you pick up another lens. That's what critical race theory is. It is a lens by which you can look at the world to examine to see if the theory that you witness makes more sense through that lens or not. Not scary. You can put them down. Pick up something different. So this notion of universities in particular, and I don't know a university that's not interested in, first and foremost, academic freedom, which is an underlying premise of all higher ed institutions, that the faculty own the curriculum. They create the knowledge. That's what it means to be a professor, to profess the knowledge that you had helped create. To write a dissertation means you have created new knowledge. You've explored and learned something that perhaps other people didn't know, or you look at it from a different place because you applied a different lens to that very concept, right? So this notion of we can't talk about these things. If you can't talk about controversial things on a college campus, where can you talk about them? That's indeed what they were created for dialogue and discussion and pulling threads and trying to figure out what is truth, what is pure inquiry. And so protecting that is critical in order to make sure that not only are we producing a solid workforce that can go out and create STEM and do all types of really good, cool things to fuel the economy, but an educated citizenry that protects our very democracy, the underlying of our entire country. So just this education is to create an educated workforce. We need that, that's critical. But a citizenry that protects our democracy. In order to do that, you need to be able to think. In order to think, you need to know what questions to ask. In order to know what questions to ask, you need more data. More data, more lenses, more information. And so this notion that we can't study is something that needs, I think, is an existential threat to all that we say we care so dearly about. If we get to the point that we can't talk about those things that make us afraid in a setting that is supposed to allow us to be educated and learn, then what are universities and school for?
Kay is just absolutely amazing. So smart and so insightful. So Moti asked me to kind of talk about the spiritual human, spiritual religious dimension to this entire conversation. And I want to begin by just saying, man, it's been said in different ways, but I want to say it in my own way, that critical race theory, pretty much, it is a academic, intellectual approach to history in terms of understanding what happened in American history through the lens of race. That's what it actually is. But the way that it's being used by the right is what they always do. They take something, they create a label, and they slap it on something, and then they just frighten people to death with it. And that's what's happened. Because beneath all of that, what we're talking about is Black history. And the story of Black people in America has always been undertold, mistold, dismissed, ignored, and rejected. America wants to forget the history of Black people in America because our story is the story of how America isn't so beautiful, isn't so great, heroic, noble, and free. Racism and slavery are not footnotes to American history. You can't tell the story of America without talking about free slave labor and the suppression of Black humanity and citizenship until 1965. It's human nature to want to get rid of the things that remind you of you at your worst. That's what's going on. It's like, that's kind of what we hear as people say, but who wants to be reminded? Who wants to talk about when we were at our worst? Why can't we talk about when we were at our best? But at what cost do we do this? As we seek, and I want to say this, hopefully there are some, I don't know, hopefully there are some folks on the other side of this who are listening. If not, then we speak to those so that we can build some momentum around advocacy uh, for the next legislative session here in Kansas. But as we seek to protect the sensibilities of white children, will we ignore the humanity of Black and brown children? Do we not want our children to be raised to be truth seekers, as Kay has said, truth seekers, truth tellers, and problem solvers? Do we want to raise children who can only survive if they are sheltered from history, sheltered from truth, sheltered from the possibility of seeing all people as equal? Do we yearn to just protect our beliefs, or do we want to see the world as clearly as we can? And what will it do to our humanity if we intentionally and actively engage in a social effort to suppress the history and thereby the humanity of Black people? What does that do to our humanity? How can we ever avoid becoming deeply distorted people if we commit our souls to fear, deceit, and the suppression of truth? And then what of your religion and your faith? Isn't religion supposed to inspire us to become better people? Isn't religion supposed to inspire us to be courageous? Isn't religion supposed to inspire us to be kind and to treat people the way that we ourselves want to be treated? If our religion doesn't make us better people, kinder people, more generous and more service-oriented people, then what's the point of it? Do we see faith as a tool to help us gain, grow, and maintain wealth, privilege, and power? Speaking of power, let me speak to my fellow Christians. Did not Jesus say that the first step to becoming a follower is to pick up your cross and follow him? Isn't the cross a symbol of sacrifice and service? And isn't this call from Jesus a call to give up power, and privilege for the sake of others? To all of us who are people of faith, in particular, the Judeo-Islamic Christian traditions who share the creation story, are we not all created in the image of God with sacred worth and eternal value? Should we value the humanity of our own children more than we value the humanity of others' children? Will we dismiss the call to love others as we love ourselves? Now, to my white brothers and sisters, and within the, you can call it faith, religion, but I speak to your humanity because for me, being a Christian means that I'm being fully human. That's what it means to be a Christian, is to be fully human. You don't have to do what's right. You have the power, the money to outvote us, to block our vote, to dismiss our vote. And even if we win, you have the power to change the rules. You control the wealth of this nation. But if you discount the story of Black people, you will lose your humanity. And if you are a person of faith, you will lose the integrity of your public witness. Now, to Black and brown people, as we move towards building advocacy around this issue, I want to say this to my Black and brown brothers and sisters. At the end of the day, even if others want to suppress our story, we have to own it and tell it ourselves and make sure that it's never relegated to the footnotes of our collective memory. Get involved, fight, tell our story, wake up, and stay woke beyond when a Black person is running for a high-profile office. No matter who gets elected to office, what matters is what legislation those persons can get passed. And if we are silent, they will not have the political backing to push for what is right on this or any other issue. And finally, Black and brown people, let's love ourselves. I mean, even when the world despises us, let's love ourselves. And let's stop selling out our people and our causes in order to win the fake favor of some white people who tell us, I like you. Let's love ourselves enough to do what is right for ourselves and the world without having to worry about acceptance, because we accept ourselves. Amen.
Wow. Amen. Thank you so much, everybody. Wonderful. So we're going to move to questions. I just want to say a word here about the advocacy that Reverend Johnson was talking about. So we know for a fact that there will be anti-CRT legislation in the Kansas legislature next year. And they're building support for it every day. The same people who are complaining about different things in school boards are complaining about this. They're hearing it as I said, they're hearing it from TV, they're hearing it from the radio every single day. There's a lot of groundwork being done on the suppression front, on the suppression side. We are not mobilized to stand against this onslaught. So our purpose here tonight, as well as sharing some witness and some facts, some truth with our audience, is to begin to build a constituency that will be active on this issue. And that means Black people and other people of color, Native Americans, and but especially so activating the most of people of color that we can, but also saying to white churches, in particular, white churches who are supportive of Kansas Interfaith Action, that your voice is absolutely vital in this effort. Because if I go, or if Reverend Johnson goes to see a white legislator, it's just going to be, it's just going to hear it as noise. I mean, they'll listen to us sometimes respectfully and sometimes less so, but they're not going to change because of us. But if their constituents and their neighbors come to them and say, we don't want the truth about American history to be suppressed. We don't want free speech and free inquiry to be suppressed. We don't want the authentic history of this country and our Black brothers and sisters to be suppressed, then that means something. And the difference between a win and a loss can be 2 or 3% in some cases. 2 or 3% of white people, really. So go look at what your church says about race. Go look at the ELCA website or the United Methodist Church website or the UCC website or the Presbyterian website or the Episcopalian website. They all have statements. They all have statements. And they're on this side. Now, you as a white Christian might not feel the same way, but take a look at what your church is teaching and take it seriously. Now, we're going to have to be vocal. We're going to have to fill hearing rooms. We're going to have meetings with legislators. I know that the school lobby, or active school activists, education activists, and probably teachers' unions will be on this side also. We're not quite sure what the coalition is going to look like yet. We're just starting now. But we know that we need to be vocal and visible quite often in the next legislative session if we want to stop the worst of this from happening. So we ask that you join this, and if you don't know how to do that, please be in touch. Kansas Interfaith Action will help you build the skills that you need. We'll help put you in touch with who you need to talk to. We try to really make it easy. Please be in touch with us because it's very vital that we turn out in numbers to stand up for the truth and to stand up for the best of America. I think Reverend King and Frederick Douglass too, they didn't curse America. They wanted America to be its best self. And how does America be its best self? By fully incorporating people of color. America wasn't a democracy until 1965. All right, so anyway, I've talked enough. So what we'd like to do now is take any questions that people have. We have people in the room, and we also have people online on Facebook and YouTube. And our dear friend, Pastor Oliver, is going to be monitoring the chat and sharing any questions that have. If you're in the hall and you have a question, please raise your hand, and somebody will bring a microphone to you.
Mine is simple. How can you listen to what they just said and accept that our legislature is going to consider this? You guys were amazing.
Always good to have a fan. Thank you.
Were you going to answer her question?
It wasn't a question. She was giving us props.
Okay, very good.
Senator.
Good evening, everyone. I'm State Senator Oletha Faust-Kudo, and I'm not here to share my theory, although I do have one. I want to thank Rabbi Moti, Staceynell, the new director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission, and my friend, Dr. K. Monk Morgan, and especially the pastor of St. Mark United Methodist Church, Pastor Robert Johnson. So my question is this, and I think I'll pose it to K with the E, so when I was in high school at Wichita East High School, I had a Black history class taught by one of the educators, and his name was Mr. White, actually. I just recently heard that there may be efforts to eliminate Black history from our K through or high school classes. So can you kind of share the difference of the critical race theory as opposed to Black history being taught in our schools? And so as I sit down here this evening, this dear lady here behind me, Lynn is her name. I didn't know her, and she tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Are you Oletha? Well, my friend Lori Lawrence just loves you." And so now I have a new friend, Lynn. I love you too. But Kay, I'm really concerned because this upcoming election, local election, I've never heard before, Pastor Johnson, here in Wichita, especially, the school board members. They are really concerned because it is an effort to take those school board members that we have now on with USD 259 to get them out, to get other members in there who would be on whatever the best side of this critical race theory is, depending on the lens you're seeing it out of. So if you could just give us your theory on the difference of those two issues. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Yes.
Before Kate answers, I just want to thank Senator Fascudo for being here. I thank you for, you work so hard in the community. For you to be here today, a week and a half ago, we were doing a deal on payday loans. You were right there in the middle of that. And you're just right here in the heartbeat of the community, fighting for the issues that matter to our people. And I just want to publicly thank you. I did not have my glasses on earlier. I didn't know who you were. So, yes.
Good evening.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for the question, because they are two very different things. In fact, a Black History course or ethnic studies course, even at the collegiate level, is very different. Having taken both, at no point was I exposed again to critical race theory. You got to search for that. The courses that our high school students are most readily exposed to, and even our collegiate students, really is on just the history of a people. There are no theory, it's a history course without theory. So it's dates and places and people and the why and the implications of those dates, places, people, and experiences. Critical race theory, again, is literally a lens by which you look at data and information. It's usually only accessible, it's a pretty thick application. For example, when writing a dissertation, I used a theory by Vincent Tinto. And when I'm writing my dissertation, I propose this theory to look at this particular phenomena, and I provide that to my professor, and they say that's either a really good lens or it isn't. Go find another one. And I got an opportunity to explore several theories in my practice, because finding the right one is difficult. To explain the phenomena or to study the scientific inquiry that you have. In a high school Black history class, it is not scientific inquiry. Critical race theory is a research concept. History is people, places, dates, figures, and how those things came to be. It is factual. Theory is subjective, right? The history in itself, the date it happened, is the date it happened. The people who were there are the people who were there. The theoretical framework differs in that it is a subjective theory that some people, a professor, wrote it down and said, when I look at it with these glasses, this makes much more sense to me. I can see a phenomenon much more clear as a result of these glasses. So I'm gonna call this a thing, and I'm gonna write a book about it, I'm gonna write a paper, and I'm gonna get published, and it's gonna work in academia. That stuff doesn't show up in a Black history course at all. At all, not a part of the curriculum.
Thank you. We are monitoring over several different platforms, so I'm going to ask my counterpart that's up top in media, if you have a microphone, to just chime in if you have any questions. I believe Kathy Eberly, I'm monitoring the Kifa page right now. I think that Dr. K. Morgan's answered your question for a basis on what CRT is. We'll move forward with a question from Chad Langdon. He says, the devil's advocate question. What do you think is the best argument that the other side has to support an anti-CRT agenda? Is there even one? I hear people say they are against it, but have no real reason to state why. Pastor Johnson's shaking his head no.
I think there's so the person who sort of is the main think tank person from this is at Heritage Foundation, and he basically said, there's a very famous tweet that goes around about this that says what he's trying to do is make sure is tar everything with the epithet critical race theory. So to make everything radioactive on the virtue of it being called critical race theory. Americans are notoriously anti-intellectual, and they don't like egghead stuff. So critical race theory is very eggheady. So if you call something, you've got the combination of white racism and political power and anti-intellectualism. Those three things are what's making this up, all right? There's not an argument, it's easy for me to say, there's not an argument that there's CRT in K12 or that CRT should be outlawed in college. That's not a valid argument. It's a thing that's meant to build up passion amongst the 30% of people who, want to maintain the country that they've always known. That's the way I would put it. It's not and the other thing about this is, and I've said this to Pastor Johnson in the past, you're not going to convince somebody that they're wrong by arguing this logically, because it's not about logic. What we need is to build enough strength that we can make there be a cost to pushing this thing through, a political cost.
Okay, we have a question from Renee Goodwin. It says, as a small town Kansas pastor, how do I convince my congregants that critical race theory is not what Fox News tells them it is?
So I think advocacy, I think education, of course, but you're dealing with the issue of people not wanting to think. People have been anti-intellectual anyway. So, a lot of sophisticated arguments won't do it. But I do think we have to do some educating. I mean, you can't totally ignore that issue. We've got to have some facts, and we've got to have some data. But then I think beyond that is engaging in advocacy and exposing them to conversations beyond Fox News. So if the only place where they hear discussion of critical race theory is on Fox News, then Fox News will define the issue for them. But as a pastor, I would want to expose my folks to multiple voices, so that they're not being their minds, their ways of thinking are not being dominated by one media source or one source period, and that they're engaging in conversation. I think when people talk about issues, there's a learning that takes place in the process of conversation. That's why sitting together over a meal is so important, right? Like something is imparted in that moment that can't happen through media and through classrooms and through intellectual conversations. Sitting together at table, at meal, breaking bread does that. There's a way of engaging. So I would create a community dinner and invite people into it, have your church folks there, and engage in not just conversation about CRT, but engage in all the conversations that are pressing up against our humanity right now.
And I guess I would add to that oftentimes it's not really the pastor who has to lead these conversations. In some church settings, find allies in the community, people who are of goodwill and want to do work on this issue, and have them lead a conversation about it. A study session about America's racial history, a study session about CRT as a political talking point, and lead from behind. That's much more. Then you don't become the lightning rod, but you help to put people in positions where they can help you have that conversation with your folks. Now, we've also, with Kansas Interfaith Action, we've had sort of history lessons. We had a 6-session seminar earlier this year about America's racial history and how these conversations can be had in white churches. I think that's something that we'll do again. But what's the most important thing, I think, is the eagerness or the willingness to have this conversation and not to just put it to the side for the sake of convenience or, a false sense of peace. peace, but there is no peace, right? Somebody said that, I think.
Just real quick I want to brag on someone just a moment, speaking of that issue. So there's a pastor here by the name of Kyle Ketchelmeyer. He's an ECC pastor, Evangelical Covenant Church pastor, pastors the Journey Church, who had come to a couple of KIFA events, had been to some of the things we've been doing. Senator Aletha just engaged, reaches out to me one day and said, "Hey, I've been watching your broadcast on Wednesday night. I've seen you from a distance at some of the KIFA events and other events, and I am intentionally reaching out to you for this specific purpose, to build a friendship." Right. So that's on a personal level. And if the pastor does it and can get other folks in the congregation to do that. So let's move beyond the political spectrum. That's important. And I'm so grateful for him, because he's helped me to understand that next level of helping people, the advocacy piece, not just on the local level and doing the hands-on stuff, but the advocacy, changing the systems and structures that create issues, but also building friendships. So Kyle, thank you for that. And he just awesome.
Hi, my name is Holly Terrell, and I am actually running for school board. And one of the main questions that voters ask me is about CRT. I have conversations with them. I try to educate best I can, but I want to also be able to provide support to educators. What is your recommendation for something I can do to help support educators when they come to me with questions with fear of teaching actual history? Holly Terrell.
I don't know that I have a really good answer for that. I think some work has to be your calling. And if indeed you're called to be in education, if you're called to be in front of a classroom where your job is to prepare young people to go out into a big, bad, scary world with every skill that they possibly have, you end up digging deep in order to do that. And I don't want to be cavalier in that I'm not concerned. Like my colleague, I did some research and coming here and reading article after article of educators, particularly African-American educators, that are just exhausted and exasperated by the experience such that they don't want to be in education anymore. And that's horrifying. I'm a mother of 2 African-American men. Neither of them ever experienced an African-American male teacher. K12, K16, never saw a Black man stand up in the front of their classroom. And so that's part of the issue, right? Is making sure that we have a diverse teacher professorate that can impart their personal experiences in those spaces. And those of us that have come through those systems tend to have a little, I don't want to say less fear, because the fear is real, but a greater conviction. Because you can be a lot of things, but I'm gonna never be anything other than Black. Every time I show up, I'm gonna be this. And so I don't have a choice but to make sure that the young people that I get a chance to engage with are best prepared for that experience.
I think what I would say to you is the best thing that you can do is to look that person in the eye and say, I will have your back. I will be on your side. That's what people need, is they need to feel like they're not taking the bullets by themselves. They need to feel that people in positions of political authority have their back. And I believe that if you look that person in the eye and you say that, that'll mean a lot to them. And do it.
My name is Jan Swartzendruber. I have been a political activist in Kansas. I've been in Topeka a lot for this cause and that cause. I've also been a bridge builder, and I've had a newsletter called that, which is for mixing people of different backgrounds, different faiths, different races. And I just want to push back a little bit on the idea that critical race theory is a theory or an ideology, because there are a lot of facts we need to know. And the books that I have read in the last year, it has been the facts in there that has changed my view of how we have kept people of color down in a caste-like situation. So the new Jim Crow has tons of numbers about people going to prison, Black people going to prison for drug offenses. The Color of Law has the whole history of why Black people couldn't buy property in certain places, starting with people coming back from the wars or people trying to work in the defense industry during the wars, and all the way through what the laws were, what the covenants were in neighborhoods. Stamped from the Beginning is another one that deals with the ideology that's kind of been used and invented to back up what's strictly an economic greed system. And so I'm sure Fox News is making great hay with this, but we all know that they're just scared because they're white people and they don't want people of color outnumbering them. But I think if we approach it as an ideology, in fact, I don't know who named it critical race theory. Critical sounds like you're being picky and fussy and nasty. Race, and it's not just a theory. There are tons and tons of facts to show you why Black people tend to live in poverty and why they tend to have lower education and all of that stuff. So I'm just like, and not to diminish anything about having personal relationships and backing people up like a teacher and saying, I've got you. I think those emotional connections and relationships are crucial, but there's an education thing that has to happen, and I don't know how you do it in a grade school level or a high school level. But I don't think that we should feel it's only college educated or graduate educated people that can get this, that there's a reason for these disparities.
So I'll take a swing at this one. So I think part of the issue that leads to the confusion is the mixing of critical race theory, and to borrow what you do, critical race theory. That even to my mind, I think what you're talking about is teaching of history. Like you say, or like you said, there are facts, there are dates, there are people who were there. And teaching children to think critically about history is one thing, but that is not what critical race theory is. And I think that's where we're getting tripped up. That there are certain factions that have decided that that's the new boogeyman is critical race theory, and they attach that to anything, and they run with it. And I think Dr. Dr. K, I'm going to call you K, has done an excellent job of explaining very clearly what critical race theory actually is. And, but that to me is different than, as to your point, learning about history with a critical eye, to say it's just not as simple as we've been taught. So I think that also kind of speaks to what happens with Black History Month, or what happens with diversity and equity training for either for teachers, or diversity and equity issues and ideas at all, because I know that has started to become an issue that's hitting school boards. In my area, they're asking city council, people who are running for city council, questions about critical race theory, and I'm like, I don't think that really has anything to do with city council, but it's coming up in a lot of issues. And so I think it does take a lot of explaining, but to not be afraid to look at history critically. But that's not critical race theory. Like, I don't know, I feel your pain with that. But just to not to be afraid to look at history critically.
Let's take one or two more.
You sure just one or two? I've got a live virtual audience.
All right, let's see how it goes.
Okay, we appreciate everyone that's online with us. I want to, David DeRoller wants to know if you can give a basic differentiation between 1619 and CRT.
Everything she said about CRT, right? I think, can we agree that that is a grad school level framework that's, something that can be applied, that you either can accept or reject. That's critical race theory. 1619, I watched the whole 2-hour presentation of the 1619, and that just seems to be looking at the contributions of Black people from 1619 with the making the argument that the history of America, you cannot talk about the history of America without talking about the history of Black people and their contributions to America. That the contribution, that the impact of slavery on American, you cannot talk about America without talking about the history of slavery. Like, there's no way to pull those two things apart. You cannot talk about the wealth that was generated in America, or the economic systems that came about in America, or the social structure that we see today. You cannot talk about the music that happens in America. You cannot talk about the art that happens in America. That if we are going to talk about America at all, we have to acknowledge that America was changed drastically by the arrival of slaves in 1619. So, but even that is not critical race theory, right? They're kind of separate things.
So, but I do want to. I think it's important for us to say this, and not that it hasn't already been said, but to really clarify. So, regardless of what CRT really is, regardless of what the theory, what's happening with it is that it has been taken by people who have no clue what it is to pass legislation on state levels to prevent the teaching of Black history in classrooms. In the state of Texas right now, there's legislation going forward where they're trying to basically say you can't teach on these subjects, and has nothing to do with CRT. In reality, all it is Black history. And folks, I'm just telling you, I grew up, Kate mentioned her boys growing up without ever seeing an African-American male teacher. I had an African-American male teacher, but if I can tell you that I grew up, and what I was taught from grades 1 through 12, what I was taught about Black history is that there was one paragraph that we were slaves, and then there was a paragraph on Martin Luther King Jr., and that was it. All the other wonderful stuff that happened in America was attributed to white people and was like Black people were a footnote, and that was it. And they want to continue that. There's a kind of awareness that has happened in America since the Civil Rights Movement, and they want to shut that out, and we cannot allow that. And it's even bigger than the Black. It's just it's a humanity issue. We cannot allow folks to pass laws to shut down and reject and omit the history of a whole race of people who were critical to the development of this country. We cannot allow that to happen.
I would even almost go so far to say, because I don't know if you noticed this, the little history lesson I gave you about Kansas didn't talk about Kansas Black history. Right? So I think it's not even so much, it's in addition to that there's a push to not talk about Black history. It's more chilling to me because there's a push to not talk about history. Right? Like I did not, even as I was saying, I didn't bring up my great-grandfather. I talk about my great-grandfather all the time, who was born enslaved, but after emancipation, made his way to KU and became the first African-American to graduate from KU School of Law, right? And so then he became a judge and a lawyer. So then we could talk about Kansas Black history, but anything that I told you, all that new information wasn't Kansas Black history. It was Kansas white history. But that doesn't even want to make it into the mainstream because it's still looking at history with an appreciation for actually what is the truth of history. So 1619 is like, well, we cannot deal with the history of America without looking at the truth of what American history is. And critical race theory is something entirely else. Like I think I'm just going to steal everything that you said moving forward. Okay, thank you.
Black history is not incidental to American history. It's not American history and then there's Black history on the side. It's Black history is integral to American history, and that's a lens through which this country has never looked at its own history. And so that's when you start to do that, it challenges things. It challenges power structures. It challenges the way people have always thought about themselves and the way they've thought about the way they were brought up to think about this country. So it is scary. It can be scary, but it's also freeing and it's liberating, and it makes us a better country. I believe that.
I gotta chime in here. Dr. Anna Chandler, who was my ethnic studies teacher several years ago, shared a lesson that I will never forget, and I continue to say anytime I get a chance to. She said, history is like an accident at a four-way stop. Whichever corner you're standing on is the account that you're going to give. It's no less true if I'm standing on the 17th, the north side. What I see is what I see and what I experience. If you're standing on the south side and what you see is different than me, it's only because you're on a different corner. What we're trying to do in the United States of America and other places is to tell history from all four corners, which is a 360-degree view. Yeah? A 360-degree view instead of a 90-degree view. Who doesn't want to see the whole thing? Just give us the whole thing and trust us to make truth of that.
Okay, I gotta say this too. Like Caucasian women have got to. So when we talk about the version of history that's been taught, it not only excludes black people, it doesn't even tell the truth about women. It's like the only people who did anything were white men, right? Like they did all the creating, they did all the inventing, they were the only innovators, and you get two paragraphs of black people and one paragraph for women. And it is astonishing me when I watch the media and I see women advocating for this crap. I'm sorry, we're in a church, aren't we?
My church, your church.
When I see white women advocating for this legislation, it was amazing. I'm like, are you insane? So you're basically agreeing with the exclusion of your history, your part in history. So it is just, yeah.
Whiteness is a hell of a drug. All right, so we got here.
I'm Adrian Hicks. I just wanted to quote Dr. Bell in this moment because as we talk about critical race theory, he's credited with being the author of critical race theory. And one of the things that struck me about what he wrote, and I think this was back in '76, says, unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Now, what I'm reading from is a dissertation by Dr. Tommy J. Curry. What he posits at the end of that sentence is one of the key theses of critical race theory is that racial equality under the current system of liberal American constitutional democracy is impossible. He goes on to talk about, especially when we get to a point where we're not mentioning the foundation of critical race theory, i.e. Dr. Bell. He says the result of this incorporation is not the de-radicalization of the political ideas and motivations of Black people, but a stratagem designed to redirect the pessimism of Black critiques against American democracy and replace it with optimism. I'm all over the place.
That's okay, but I'm gonna help you out.
Thank you. All right. And to replace it with optimism in the possibility of democratic reform despite the death and dying of Black populations within their respective nations. So it's kind of a cautionary tale for us to not venture too far away from what actually is the foundation of critical race theory. And I guess my question is, to what end are we looking for legislation? And if we're talking about teaching it, who's going to teach it?
We are not looking for legislation.
Advocacy about in the legislative process around critical race theory, correct?
Well, I think it would be advocacy for people to make sure that history is taught.
Well, okay, so we teach history, but that's not critical race theory. You just said that.
That's what we've been saying all
That's
night.
the point, yeah, that critical race theory is not being taught.
Right.
Nor is
Yeah.
anyone advocating that it should be. It's except that in that the university setting should remain open to an exploration of the theory, of that as a lens through which to see history, open to criticism from all sides, just like any other way of looking at the world.
Even the first paragraph you read, I think you listed several theories that would be considered approaches. And so I was like, it's interesting that critical race theory has suddenly entered the zeitgeist as this big bad, when in your first paragraph you listed like 4 theoretical frameworks that I think would be applied in grad school that I think, and you read it so quickly that I was like, okay, there's one. I was counting as you were going, and I was like, I couldn't give you a 2-second sentence explanation of any of them. Who wrote?
He was one of the.
But I think that's the point, is that critical race theory falls in like with that first paragraph you read that listed all the other critical theoretical frameworks that people do economic or academic, research and write. That's where critical race theory actually belongs, and it's not done in high schools because, yeah.
All right. Pastor Oliver, one more?
One more? One, two, two more.
Two more.
Two more.
After hearing what you just said there and what the pastor was saying as far as, and then you guys said no one is teaching it. So my question is just how do we move forward to get someone to teach it on all levels? So he broached the question about you didn't want legislation about it. So what is the solution to get this taught and not stop and just discarded to the sides? Because that's what it sounds like what they're doing with legislation in Texas.
So the law in Texas was to try to limit what could be taught about having to do with race in the schools. Under the calling it critical race theory, but really just attacking the teaching of American history. We're not advocating for critical race theory to be taught in high school, as Dr. Morgan said. It's probably not intellectually possible, or really curricularly possible, to teach it on a high school level. Now, if you as an adult wanted to learn about it, I'm sure there's books that we could recommend for you, and there's ways you could learn about it. And I think it would be valuable for any adult to learn about it. But what we're talking about is an effort to forbid the teaching of authentic history under the ruse of calling it critical race theory, and being opposed to that straw man that they've built up. Okay, last one.
Hey, how you doing? I guess there's a lot of different directions we can go with this, so I'll do my best to stay on point. So I'm gonna start by saying, Dr. Monk Morgan, your son had one black teacher, male, and a really good one. Yeah, I just want to remind you of that. But no, I had her son in class. But no, I wanted to kind of piggyback off of a couple things that was said. One, Brother Adrian Hicks had mentioned Derek Bell, and someone had asked who Derek Bell is. Derek Bell was a Harvard law educator. So critical race theory comes from legal scholarship initially. And someone else said who came up with the term, it was Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal professor as well at 2 universities, at Columbia on the East Coast and USC on the West Coast currently. So just wanted to answer those questions. But you're talking about the early 70s, 72, 73, and these legal scholars were saying, okay, after the civil rights movement, everything stopped. So we need to take a look at it. And so what did they take a look at? They take a look at the law. And so that's really where critical race theory starts. We're critical of the law and all of these other systems that are supported by the law, and saying that maybe it doesn't say legal segregation and legal slavery anymore, but there's still some oppressive things in the law and every foundation of America that is supported by the law. You don't see it going to education until 1994, and that's when 2 educators, Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate, who just in May became the first African-American president of LSU, which is interesting, but that's a whole nother story. But so these 2 educators in 1994 decide we need a framework to look at oppression in education. And so they applied that to education in a study that they did in 1994 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it was never, and don't get me wrong, teaching history the correct way is important, but that's not what Black theory is. And a couple other people said that. I just wanted to reiterate that again. But what it does look at, it looks at these systems of oppression within education. Yes, schools are desegregated, but Black kids are still having segregated experiences inside desegregated buildings. We have a school to prison pipeline There are systems of oppression that are causing that. Our kids are not bad. We keep pointing fingers outward. It's the family, it's poverty, but we never point fingers inward and look at what's going at with the schools. Critical race theory challenges us to look inward at the schools. It challenges us to look at all of these systems that were built on white supremacy. And so I don't have a question. I just wanted to clear the air on a couple of things.
I think that's a great point to end. I think Dr. Monk Morgan wants to say something.
I just want to acknowledge Dr. Harrison is absolutely correct, and because he did
He
instruct
did,
both
he
of
did.
my, I think both of my sons. Just one, okay, the other one lost out because now he's not going to ever have that. Well, maybe. But I also want to acknowledge that Dr. Harrison is so astute in his sharing because he too is Dr. Harrison.
Amen.
And his dissertation research introduced him to many of these concepts.
I think that's a great point to end. I believe
Not in
that
high school.
Right. I believe that that answered Chester Nichols' question, who's online. You made some points about our education system that there were questions about, so I believe that you can call it a night if you so choose.
I have one more. Can I ask? It's not about CRT. I just want to know, can we make the sound system sound like this on Sunday morning?
You've got Willard Rice on the mic, so yes, on the board. Thank you. We've got so many raves about this panel, specifically the two women on the board, might I add. There've been all types of wonderful comments just about how awesome it is for our state to have you, and we're thanking Mrs. Nell for coming on board, and how Wichita State has a gem in Dr. Morgan. So thank you guys for all of your efforts this evening.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks for watching online. Thank you to the panelists, and we look forward to building with you in the coming weeks and months. Thanks so much.